Very good morning, friends. I hope you're all safe and healthy. Well, in the series of Index 113, my focus in the previous videos has been on the concept builder, on the identification of the principal market, on the identification of the most advantageous market. And I'm using the words very carefully. I'm saying that identification of the principal market, identification of the most advantageous market. But today I'm going to discuss more to do with the computation of a fair value. So, are you indirectly saying that identification is like a step number one and the computation is like a step number two? Exactly. So we can say that, if somebody were to ask me in terms of a fair value computation, I would say that there are broadly two steps. One is that you identify the principal market with the help of what we call the volumes achieved in the market. And once you identify the principal market, the second step is the computation of the fair value. And if on the other hand, the principal market cannot be identified, then in this particular case, we'll look at the most advantageous market. And the identification of the most advantageous market is based on the net amount received looking at the value terms, which I've already discussed in the previous videos as well. So today in this particular video, what we're going to see, we're going to look at the impact of the transaction and the transportation cost in terms of computation of the fair value. Let's find out in detail. अनअकैडमी पर शुरू होने जा रहा है योद्धा 2.0। मई 22 और नवंबर 22 के बच्चे जो अपने सीए की तैयारी कर रहे हैं, उनके लिए सीए फाइनल ग्रुप 1 के लिए 9 जून 2021 से बैचेस शुरू होने जा रहे हैं। और इन बैचेस के अंदर आपके साथ इंडिया के टॉप एजुकेटर्स जुड़ेंगे, जिनमें मैं फाइनेंशियल रिपोर्टिंग ले रहा हूं, अमित पोपली सर लॉ ले रहे हैं, राहुल मलकान सर एसएफएम और ऑडिट ले रही हैं खुशबू सांघवी मैम। तो पूरे के पूरे ग्रुप 1 की आप अपनी तैयारी कर सकते हैं। बैचेस के अंदर कोई क्लैश ऑफ टाइमिंग्स नहीं है। मेरा बैच मॉर्निंग में मंडे टू सैटरडे है, जिसके अंदर मॉर्निंग 6 to 8 है और ऐसी अलग अलग बैचेस के टाइमिंग्स हैं। तो आप अपने पूरे ग्रुप 1 की तैयारी इसके अंदर कर सकते हैं। यानी सब्सक्रिप्शन एक और उसके अंदर सभी के सभी आपके सब्जेक्ट्स कवर हो जाएंगे, जिसके अंदर आपके पास लाइव इंटरेक्टिव क्लासेस होती हैं, अनलिमिटेड एक्सेस रिकॉर्डेड लेक्चर्स का मिलता है, हर 4th सेशन आपका डाउट क्लियरिंग सेशन होता है, मॉक टेस्ट होते हैं। तो सब कुछ आपको एक ही सब्सक्रिप्शन के अंदर मिलता है। ये हमारी कुछ लिस्ट है जो प्राउड लर्नर्स रह चुके हैं, जिनमें से बहुत से बच्चों की रैंक्स भी आई हैं और इनके अलावा भी और बहुत से बच्चे हैं जो अनअकैडमी प्लेटफॉर्म पर पढ़े हैं। और इसके लिए सब्सक्रिप्शन के अलग अलग प्लान्स अवेलेबल हैं, तो आप अपने बजट के हिसाब से उन प्लान्स को सिलेक्ट कर सकते हैं अनअकैडमी की ऐप डाउनलोड करके, और उस पर आप 10% डिस्काउंट अवेल कर सकते हैं। मेरा कोड इस्तेमाल कर सकते हैं CAKB10। तो इस तरीके से आप ग्रुप 1 ग्रुप 2 अलग भी ले सकते हैं, बोथ ग्रुप्स के कॉम्बो ऑफर्स भी ले सकते हैं और दोनों पर आपको 10% डिस्काउंट मिलेगा। तो किस बात का इंतजार है, आइए लेट्स क्रैक इट। Well, as I said that, there are two steps in terms of computation of a fair value when I'm looking at a most advantageous market, because we've got two cases we can say. One is where you can identify the principal market based on the volumes and then compute a fair value. We'll talk of that later. Then the second case is that the principal market cannot be identified. You need to identify the most advantageous market in step 1 and compute the fair value in terms of step 2. So focusing on the case where the principal market cannot be identified, you identify the most advantageous market. We've already seen that when you identify the most advantageous market, we need to see that we need to maximize the net amount received. That means we reduce the transaction cost and the transportation cost both and see the market where the net amount received is supposed to be the highest. After you identify the most advantageous market, the next step is in terms of computation of the fair value. Now remember, when you are computing a fair value, whether it is a case of a principal market or whether it is a case of a most advantageous market, we would reduce only the transportation cost, not the transaction cost. Because the transaction cost is never considered to be a characteristic of an asset or liability. So the important issue is that when you identify the most advantageous market, you reduce the transaction cost, you reduce the transportation cost. But when you compute a fair value, we reduce only the transportation cost and not the transaction cost. So I think we can definitely put it like this, that as I said, there are two cases. Let's go to the case number one. Identification of a principal market is based on the market volumes achieved, not the values. Computation of the fair value in that principal market identified in step number one would consider only the transportation cost. So you can see we take the price received minus the transport cost only. That's case one. The second is when you're looking at a most advantageous market, then identification would consider the net value received. That means both the transaction cost and the transportation cost is reduced. After identifying the most advantageous market, then you go to the computation of the fair value, and that would consider only the transportation cost. So remember that identification of a principal market is a three-step procedure. Then computation of the fair value considers only transportation cost. Identification of the most advantageous market is based on the net amount received after reducing both transport and transaction costs. But then step number two, the computation considers only the transportation cost. So we do not consider any transaction cost in the computation of the fair value, whether it's a case of a principal market or it is a case of a most advantageous market. Isn't that interesting? I know you must be thinking that can we have a consolidated case study, where we club the concepts of a principal market identification and the most advantageous market, so the identification and the computation aspect becomes absolutely clear. Why not? So your wish, my command. So in this particular case, I am going to do that in the next video with you. Thank you. Take care and bye-bye.